So, Aoife has brilliantly introduced the talk already, so I don't need to highlight that title. But first of all, who are we? So I work at University College London Special Collections. Despite my very long job title, what I essentially do is introduce students at UCL East to our wonderful, wonderful collections. So I work a lot with staff and with students to try and embed what we're doing in courses. So I'm sort of part teacher, part librarian, part archivist. And I also do kind of events around our collections as well. I've been working with special collections and heritage material since 2011, which is far too long ago now. I'm really interested in public engagement with collections, education, accessibility and equality. I basically want to ensure that everybody knows about the material we have, and I want to make it open to everybody. So I spend a lot of time talking to people about how we can make our collections embedded in teaching and learning, and what we can do to kind of tailor make introductions to courses for the students and what they need, which can be quite varied. I'm really sorry in advance about my hat hair for this conference, because this is going to be bad. Thanks, Joe. My name is Simon Farid, and I'm an invigilator, artist, and sometime academic based in London. You may have noticed that I'm not here in person today. More on that later. So for this talk, Joe will kindly be representing me and my words. You'll be able to tell that it's me speaking, as I'll be wearing this hat, which is one of Joe's many hats at this conference. I did not write this talk. Simon literally scripted this in. I mentioned that one of my jobs is being an invigilator. There are lots of different titles for this job. So just to be clear, by invigilator, I mean a gallery guard. Here are some examples of their depictions in popular films, though at the place I work, we don't wear suits. As a visual artist, a lot of my practice has to do with being an invigilator. I have a solo practice that uses invigilation as a lens to explore art world institutional dynamics and hierarchies, as well as wider ideas around surveillance, workers' material conditions, and solitary poetics. But of most relevance to us here is a now semi-dormant art collective I'm a part of called the Invigilator Research Network, or IRN. This is a changing group of artist invigilators who collectively make artworks and interventions, exploring and exploiting our day jobs. As our work is mostly critical of management and being in precarious employment, we have a complicated relationship to secrecy. Whilst some of our projects are completely public-facing, some of our work needs to be authored anonymously, and we often need to think creatively about how we disseminate certain projects to avoid the gaze of management. Alongside this public-facing work, there is a wholly covert element of IRN's practice, a series of secret works that we don't share with anyone. More on this later too. Joe and I first met whilst I was doing a creative fellowship at UCL's Institute for Advanced Studies. It was a brainstorming session seeking ideas for how to realise the now existing Culture Lab space at UCL East back in 2022. Comes on. Special collections are less well understood than other cultural heritage institutions, such as museums and libraries. I always give the example that I work a lot with small children in my spare time, and they would know what a library is. They really wouldn't know what an archive is, and they really wouldn't know what a special collection is. Simon's work looks to address practices of secrecy, clandestine publics, and the role of invigilators. And I aim to make special collections more accessible to everyone and break down barriers of use. And the hat goes back on. So what we kind of thought was that Simon got talking to me about special collections and archiving in general. And Simon hadn't done a lot of work around this subject, but he does have the informal archive of all of IRN's projects, and he wondered if there could be some connection between these and special collections practices. So we wondered if we could work together to investigate how heritage collections deal with issues of secrecy. So these are the kind of questions that we explore in our workshops. Every single thing that we've done, and I'll explain a bit more about the work we've done later, has these kinds of questions at its heart. We kind of look at how anti-institutional practices work and the role of institutional support in those practices. We also look at the IRN material itself. Simon initially came to me saying, I don't know what this is. Is this an archive? Is it a collection? Where does it fit? So we actually look at that. And we then also have a look at what we do with detritus and incidental materials, which I think has been really brilliantly talked about by some of the speakers yesterday. The idea of when do we collect, how do we collect, and when do we draw the line about stopping. We then kind of explore a little bit about the value of archiving and collecting. Should we keep everything? And what are the politics involved in making those decisions? Can collection staff manage material which has been designated secret by its creators or even from archivists? My relationship to UCL as an institution is a complex one and necessarily entails a number of complications that our collaboration continually attempts to navigate. First of all, there is a question of basic relationships to hierarchical institutions. I think IRN's practices are, at heart, a form of institutional critique from a worker's perspective. Whilst this critique is of arts institutions specifically, I do still think that there is still a form of conceptual difficulty or contradiction in attempting to read a set of essentially anti-institutional hierarchy rejecting practices through an institutional lens and the requirements that come with this. This difficulty is heightened or perhaps reflected in a series of material and practical difficulties that also crop up when trying to work with materials and people like myself who are not part of the academy. These are mostly boring things like needing to do a right to work check before each iteration of our workshops, a long delay in paying me each time, and the lack of a more embedded long-term professional development that would happen were I a part of the university. You will notice that none of these are UCL specific, but rather they reflect institutional and government formations throughout the sector and beyond. There are also physical dynamics to be negotiated, as mundane as the fact that the IRN archive is not part of UCL's collections. So I'm required to carry many boxes of heavy materials in suitcases on public transport to UCL every time we run a workshop, as well as more complex issues of UCL's buildings and rooms themselves being very difficult to non-faculty to physically enter. Finally, we can see this deficit in institutional privilege evidenced in the fact that I am not here with you today. Being an independent practitioner, I was reliant on a bursary from Artlist to attend, and because it was a lottery, I sadly wasn't lucky enough to get it. As with all of the previous, these are sector and society-wide structural difficulties that maintain barriers for non-institutional to institutional collaboration, rather than being anything specific about UCL or ARLIS. But all of these realities are a big part of what we try and explore together in our workshops. So what have we done so far? Simon and I have been working together for about 3 years now. The main workshop we've been running is Secrets, Archives and Power, which has been running at UCL East in May each year. It will probably run again in May next year, so if anyone wants to come, drop me a line. It's been really successful and generally sells out, which is really lovely. We also look at it in more student-facing work. So every term in November, we work with the Archives MA students on their core module called Concepts and Context. And we look specifically about how we archive secrets. So as people going into the sector and hopefully leading the sector in future years, we get them thinking about this kind of big ideological question, and it always works really, really well. All of this work originated in a workshop we did with Public History MA students, also at UCL East in May 2023. So it's kind of a variation on it, but it develops the work each time. Simon's notes for this just say, UCL East, Joe, building weirdness and difficulties. I am not going to talk specifically about the building weirdness and difficulties of UCL East on record, but I'm happy to chat about some of the challenges of working on a new campus off the record later on. So UCL East opened in 2023 on the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park in Stratford. It's basically everything is brand new. The building is new, the staff are mostly new, the degree programs are entirely new. There's a lot of collaborative spaces, so special collections there work within academic rooms rather than being physically part of the library. There's a real big focus at East on interdisciplinarity. So we're looking at kind of how to address global issues and prepare students for the future. If you Google UCL East, there's a very strong chance you'll come across various AI robots because there is a robots and AI department. There's lots of like AI dogs, which are kind of fun, but there's kind of a real focus in UCL East about future thinking. How do we think about sustainability and living in a global world? So a lot of the programs have this real contemporary tint. The new campus is also distant from Bloomsbury, and there is this bigger kind of moral question about how we build community and identity in a developed space. And I think that's really important to acknowledge because we have to be very careful when we're telling these narratives around East London, because there was stuff there before the Olympics. Of course there was a community, and some of the people we're trying to work with and engage with UCL's activity are the same people who have been directly affected by the gentrification and the privatization and the commercialization of this space. So we're all working together to kind of think about how we can do this in a way that's ethically fair, but also brings people in rather than shuts them out. We also wanted to talk a little bit about resisting sequencing collections, framing some of the ways in which archive material and printed material can actively resist notions of secrecy. So first of all, you've got the issues of content. One of the great things that we're doing a lot of work with, and there's been some brilliant examples of this over this conference, are about marginalised voices and activity. We can record these and give them a home. There's perpetual protection even when society changes, and there's evidence of future research. One of my favourite collections at UCL, and I have an awful lot, is the brilliant archive of the National Union of Women Teachers, which campaigned in the 20th century for equal pay for women teaching. When they were successful in getting equal pay in the 1960s, the union merged and became part of the main teaching union. But it's a brilliant, brilliant example of how to resist and how to campaign and how to centralise these issues that are affecting so many people working in the sector. So there's also the practical thing that if you've got it in an archive, it hopefully prevents physical degradation if it's stored correctly. There's also a big legal side to this too. It empowers freedom of information requests. I do not deal with them myself in my role, and I have huge amounts of respect for colleagues who do, but it's really important that we've got evidence there. There's also the kind of role of institutional accountability, and that's really important as well, evidencing what's happened at UCL in the past or other previous institutions, keeping collections kind of advocates for that. And there's also an element of copyright protection for artists and creators, which we think quite a lot about with our material. There's also the access issue. Putting art collections in a publicly accessible archive means that places are open to everybody. Very, very broadly speaking, it's far too broad a brush really, files are generally only closed for legal reasons if we're not sure about copyright or data protection and things like that. So we are in theory open to absolutely everybody. And of course, we work quite slowly to digitize material where resources allow. So we're also putting it online, which is a really good way of empowering that history. Being on the outside of the official collections helps one to see the ways in which publicly accessible archives counterintuitively sometimes produce secrets, or at least secretness. These are more often than not a side effect of an otherwise well-reasoned practice or an unintended consequence of physical or resource realities, rather than being maliciously intended, but the outcome is sometimes the same. On the slide, we've listed some of the ways archival practices produce secrets, but I'll pick out some of the key ones here. In terms of content, how things get accessioned and who decides this can lead to secrecy. This can happen on the part of the donor who selectively donates parts of a whole. You don't know what isn't in the archive. Or of course on the part of the institution itself and decision making as to what gets accessioned and what is politely declined. Data protection and copyright are obviously both good things, but nonetheless mean that information and materials can sometimes be restricted within our archives. For example, there will be many instances where the original copyright holder would clearly be very happy for their material to be digitized and shared and made available, but because they are uncontactable, the institution can't make this call for themselves, and so the material remains digitally inaccessible or digitally secret. Then there are a lot of soft and social barriers to accessing institutional archives that in essence produce secrets, at least for certain segments of the population. And I think in this room, we'll all be aware of some of those issues. There are things like people not being aware that they can use collections. Reading rooms can feel intimidating and unwelcoming, and they often have strange, onerous rules about what one can bring in. And the fact that navigating collections is often unintuitive for the uninitiated with complex organisational notation. And finally, we could mention that lack of funding and resources for collections can mean that a lot of material is uncatalogued or needs to be updated, which means that those materials are practically inaccessible. So a little bit more information about those secrets and power workshops. As we've mentioned, they've been running for 2 years now. The idea is that they bring students together with members of the public and UCL staff In practice, I would say that we get more staff and more people from the professional sector than we do students, and I really want to change that next year. But I think because of the timing of them in May, a lot of students are either not around or just focusing on their final projects. They've been developed after these previous workshops revealed an interest in secrecy, so we kind of retweaked it and worked it so that we focus specifically on what secrets mean. We have special collection staff involved, so I'm involved, but there's also collection managers, so people who look after this material on a regular basis, educators, and also our department director, Sarah Aitchison, comes along, which is really, really great to have that slightly more top-down view, alongside academics. One of my colleagues, Colin Penman, who's the head of records, does a brilliant talk about the legality of secrecy, and it's really interesting. Simon's role here is much more about artistic intervention, and we also add in special collections material to show the practical issues of secrecy. So we'll get out collections where there's different issues of secrecy, whether that's about recordings made of students, like life drawing and things like that, some letters that have previously been catalogued in terminology that we wouldn't use now, or even just printed material that's been used for blackmail and things like that. We get out a big range of things. This is a photograph of the IRN closed box. It contains documentation of a collaborative secret art project, including development notes, correspondence, incidental materials, and original artworks. An important part of the artwork itself is that it remains secret to non-IRN members. So in essence, the box is sort of a fact of a secret made physical. We always include this box in our workshops as a way to complicate and challenge archival practices that we've been discussing today. We went to Barcelona last year to present on a slightly different aspect of this, and I have no idea how Simon managed to carry this through all of the security on the train to Barcelona. The fundamental challenge that this box represents to a consideration of archival practices and hierarchies is, can the archive accommodate something that is secret even to the archivist? As we've seen above, archives can happily look after and sometimes produce secrets, but in all of these instances, the secret is still known to the institution in some form. The box asks whether we could imagine a way in which the institution could relinquish that power to the donor. On first consideration, the answer is a simple no. There are very many good reasons that the archivist would need to know about materiality of what's in the box, with the risk of rotting or contamination, radioactivity or bombing, etc. I would really like to jump in here and say that at UCL, none of our collections have been at risk of bombing since at least World War II. And when there was the Blitz in London, we removed the collections way before that happened. Don't know why bombing is in there as an example. But as we have discussed with other well-intentioned and reasoned archival practices, the unintended consequence here is one of maintaining hierarchy, the archivist being the holder and gatekeeper to secrets, and in practice, IRN secret works essentially being unarchivable. So again, can we imagine a way in which the institution could relinquish the secrecy decision to the donor? As a starting point, I can think of some outlandish workarounds involving lie detectors, sniffer dogs, feeling contents in the dark, wearing blurred glasses or viewing things at extreme distances. But all these solutions leave the basic logic of the power relationship intact. Is there another way for us to think about this? That was the end. We'll leave questions to the end. There's some links on this slide, particularly to do with Simon's work. And we've also included some further reading in this that we really like to kind of get you thinking about this. Thank you very much. I will now return to non-hat wearing duties for the rest of the time.